let us get started. Welcome to today's Australia's Biggest Book Club episode. My name's Alice Grundy. I'm a research manager here at the Australia Institute, and I'm coming to you today from unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. I would like to pay my respects to the people who have taken care of this land for many, many millennia. And we'll be talking quite a bit about taking care of country today with our guest, Clare Wright, who is the author of Näku Dhäruk, the Bark Petitions. Um, Professor Clare Wright is live in our Canberra studio, as you can see, and she's an award-winning historian, author, broadcaster, podcaster. I'm sure many of you will have listened to Archive Fever. She's currently Professor of History and Professor of Public Engagement at La Trobe University and is the author of 4 works of history, including the Democracy Trilogy with the best-selling The Forgotten Rebels of Eureka, which won the Stella Prize, You Daughters of Freedom, and the Bark Petitions. And you will also know Clare from television, from radio, and from following her online. Welcome, Clare.
Thanks, Alice. It's great to be here. And I'm really happy to be in the studio with you here, and also want to acknowledge that it's a privilege to be here on Ngunnawal Ngambri country.
Thank you. So let's start at the beginning of this really incredible story. How was it that you came to be in the position of being the carrier of this story? How did you bring it to book form?
So the Bark Petitions were something that I didn't know very much about themselves. I'd seen them in Canberra, particularly when I was researching the book prior to this in the Democracy Trilogy, the Women's Suffrage Banner, because the banner and the Bark Petitions are located just across from each other in Parliament House. So I knew of their existence, but I couldn't say that I would have really been able to tell you what they were about, beyond the basic details of them being a petition against some sort of mining interests that had occurred in northeast Arnhem Land in the 1960s. And that was the part that piqued my interest, the mining part of it, really, because I'd written the Forgotten Rebels of Eureka about a mining community, and I had a grant from the Australian Research Council to do more work on mining communities. And so I had sort of had in my mind that this was something that I might sort of look at. But it was really when I went to Arnhem Land much earlier in 2010 that with my family, for my then husband's work as a furniture maker, we were living on community in Dr. G. Yunupingu's. I actually have permission from family to call him by his name, Galaroi Yunupingu, during in discussions about this book. So Galaroi had invited my family to come up and live on his community. And it was through becoming part of that community that I started to learn more about the meaning of the Bark Petitions for Yolŋu people. And then it was in discussions with Galaroi one day when he said to me, Gale, his kinship term for me, Gale, what is it you do? And this is about 5 years into being there. And what he meant was, what do you do apart from run around after my children and cook in my house and take the women shopping? And I said, I'm an historian, Due, my kinship term for him. I'm an historian, Due. And he went, oh, you tell stories. I tell stories too. And that was the start of him wanting to tell stories together. And in particular, this is the story that he wanted to have told. And because I had some expertise in the area and I had this interest in mining, it suited me perfectly to continue on with it as well. So it was really very much a collaborative project. To the extent of the motivation for it was a very collaborative one right from the beginning. Yolŋu people felt that the story of the Bark Petitions was, in their own words, unfinished business or an open wound. And this was a story that they wanted Australia to know more widely because of the role that their ancestors had played in it. And it was a story they wanted Yolŋu young people to know more intimately as well. So it became this really wonderful, Yolŋu have a term for it, it's called balagalili, which means two ways learning. So Yolŋu were finding out things that I was discovering in the archives in Canberra and National Archives, National Library, as I went on my kind of historian's quest through the documentary research archive and finding new archives as well. and then me learning from Yolŋu people about their stories that had been passed down from the old people who had been there at the time, or many that people still remembered. Many of the people who I talked to were children at the time, and they could remember the exact moments when certain things happened. So this wonderful interplay that was really, I think, very genuinely cross-cultural and collaborative.
Mm. There's this extraordinary seamlessness in the book where you take these oral histories and discussions that you've had. There's documentary evidence, there's primary and secondary sources. I can only imagine what your research folders must look like, let alone your computer folders. How did you begin the process of synthesizing all of these incredibly different sources into one project?
Yes, well, only a researcher themselves can know what it must look like, the shelves of my filing. And I'm a paper and pen researcher. I've never managed to learn. I still research and take notes the way that I did when I was doing my PhD 4 million years ago. I've never learnt Zotero or any of the online databases that apparently make life much easier. I take a notebook and a pencil, and so I do have folders full of notebooks. And one of the things that I have done with all of my books is made them archive up. So I don't go in with a proposition. I go in with a research question and then listen to what the archives has to tell me. And it's that process of sitting and listening to the archive, and in this case, so much of the archive was oral history as well, and just listening to the land. I mean, country was archive for me in this instance as well, and being present with people and the language, being sitting in rooms full of people who are speaking a language that I only have a very basic understanding of, Yolŋu mata. And so then synthesizing all of that for me was, in a way, the basic process that I would go through with any book, which is listening to what the archive is telling you. But in this case, telling that, finding a way to communicate what the archive was telling me, was really tricky, because unlike the just telling a straight story with a beginning and middle and an end, that's how I normally would, because I write narrative nonfiction, I would find a narrative way to deal with all of the research material. And so things would get slotted in kind of sequentially, in a sense. But I was very aware with this story of wanting to, in a sense, unsettle that Western teleological progress model of time, that Yolŋu people don't think of time in a unilateral direction from, and we so often, as this is the hangover of the Western Enlightenment, we go from the Dark Ages to the light. We go from savage to civilization. That sense, and that is certainly a narrative model that the mining industry and the history of mining in Australia has employed, because it's a progress model, it's a development model, it's a growth model, and that very much fits with both the project of colonialism and imperialism, but also the project of capitalism too. And that's not the way that Yolŋu people think or talk or tell stories. Yolŋu people have what the anthropologist Stanner would have called a sense of the everywhen, that past, present, and future are all bound up in any moment and in any story, and you can't separate them. So what I tried to do in the end, the model that I found for synthesizing all that material, was to take a kind of hybrid. So I have the chronology that's there. This all plays out in 1963, which is the year that the Bark Petitions were created and were presented to Parliament. And maybe we actually need to say what the Bark Petitions were at some stage for people who don't know about them. We've jumped in at the methodology and epistemology end. But so the chronology accords to the 12 calendar months of 1963, January to December. It's also broken into the 3 seasons that white people have come to know as wet, dry, and build-up. And then within those 3 sections, it's broken into 6 sections, which are the Yolŋu seasons. And those are ones that are more accord to the rhythms of nature and what is going on with the trees and the birds and the flowers, and when the honey comes in, and when certain fish are running, and when it's a good time to collect turtle eggs. And that all accords to Yolŋu seasonal time, which of course doesn't run along a calendar, but is all cyclical. And then I also within that had these kind of what I took from Joan Didion as what she would call jump cuts, which are those moments that are maybe if this was television, and the book is, I think, quite filmic, they would be flashbacks. We would see those things in flashback. And those are really the Yolŋu storytelling elements, sometimes purely in language with an English translation, but all of those things have come from Yolŋu sources. So some of those are quite modern sources, but they reflect back on a time. Even though they might be talking about now, it's talking about something that is so universal and temporally relevant that it would fit for work for 1963 as well. So that's the only time in which I kind of step out of the 1963 archive. And I don't know, readers are telling me that it is kaleidoscopic, that is polyvocal, that they have a sense of really the two worlds that this story is told in, the Yolŋu world and the settler Australian world, and that narrative style is working for people. It's apparently a page turner, and it's a fat book, but people have told me they've read it in 3 days because they can't put it down.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I appreciated that you described yourself as a narrative nonfiction writer, because obviously you're a very rigorous historian, but it does read as a truly extraordinary story. And we'll talk a little bit about the craft of writing in a little bit. But you're right. Let's talk about 1963. What's happening? Where does the 1963 version of the story begin?
Okay, so it begins with a prologue that actually happens just before Christmas in 1962 in northeast Arnhem Land, where there has since 1935 been a Methodist mission stationed at Yirrkala, which is where the various tribes of Yolŋu people, the clans, Bapuru is the Yolŋu Mata term, have come in voluntarily to live on the mission. It's really important to state from the outset that this mission history is very different from, I think, what people's conception of mission history, the conventional conception of mission history in this country and in other settler colonies is as well, which is that missionaries came, they rounded people up, they took them off country and put them in groups that were not aligned in any kind of way, and forced First Nations people to stop practicing culture, to stop speaking language, to not intermarry, and enforced an enormous number of rules around mobility and when they could do things. This is not how the Methodist Overseas Mission operated. Methodist missionaries encouraged, supported the continuation of cultural practices, hunting, ceremony, language, and in fact all the missionaries who were there had to learn to speak Yolŋu Mata themselves. And the only reason they could learn that, and not just from ear, was that one of the Methodist missionaries, Beulah Lowe, in the 1950s had started codifying in a written script the Yolŋu language, or one of them. There's many, many dialects of it, but one of them that became the kind of universal written Yolŋu Mata. And so on one of these hunting trips at the end of 1962, a group have gone off the mission down to some tribal land on Melville Bay and had a fishing trip, hunting, fishing, kids there, Yolŋu kids, missionary kids. And then when they came back onto the mission, about 20 miles away, one of the Yolŋu men, Dembalapu, saw that there were these survey pegs in the land running through the peanut paddock near the Yolŋu, just on the tip of the mission boundary. And he said, Yolŋu Jal. He says this to Ron Croxford, the principal of the Yirrkala school, a man who I was very fortunate to be able to interview. He's almost 90. He said, Yolŋu Jal, which means who wants this? And these survey pegs hadn't been there when they left for the fishing trip. And this really then sort of sets off this kind of whodunit, Yolŋu, of this territorial skirmish for this land that Yolŋu had never considered anything other than theirs. There was no reason for them to think they were nothing other than the sovereign owners of the land, and that their laws of the land applied. Because although there had been a lot of interaction with strangers and outsiders for centuries, Macassan fishermen had come down on the seasonal trade winds and asked for permission to come onto land, to set up stations to dry treepang, harvest and dry treepang, and then they'd leave again, and there'd be an exchange of goods. There had been exchanges with Japanese fishermen. There had been exchanges with RAAF soldiers who had been stationed in what was then called the Gove Peninsula during the Second World War. All of these people had come, essentially abided by Yolŋu laws, and left again. But this looked different, and it was, because what those survey pegs ended up denoting was that mining leases to mine bauxite that had been discovered to underlay this northeast Arnhem Land corner in the late 1950s. The Menzies government had issued licenses to a French mining company to mine the bauxite, and they were starting to peg out their claim. And this had been done without the knowledge of anybody on the ground, not the Yolŋu, not the Methodist missionaries on the ground. It had been a deal between the Menzies government, the mining company, and the Methodist Overseas Mission headquarters, the big boss, in Sydney. And when this was discovered, the Reverend Edgar Wells, the superintendent of the mission, sent out a telegram, and he sent that to a number of civil rights groups down south, to newspapers, to some Labor politicians, sending out this call that there was a land grab going on in northeast Arnhem Land. I'm sure everybody thought that there would be no accountability because it was just this tiny little tip of the country 4,000 miles away from anything that was going on down south. But this telegram basically set off a chain of events in 1963 that involved the excising of a portion of the Arnhem Land Reserve for mining by the Minister for Territories, Paul Hasluck, and then a series of kind of counter-offensives to what was going on in Parliament, the signing of a paper that was effectively dispossessing Yolŋu people of their lands, and then the Yolŋu people's response to that, which in the middle of the year culminates in the creation of these petitions to Parliament. No one had ever actually known how many of them there were. There are 2 here in Parliament House in Canberra. Anybody can walk up and see them. There's one in the National Museum, and it was unclear how many others might be out there. I can absolutely reliably, empirically tell you now it was 4. And the reason why I can tell you is because I had access to an archive that no one had ever seen before, which was the archive of Reverend Edgar Wells and his wife Anne. And I discovered it in the garage of their son after I tracked him down. And Anne Wells kept meticulous notes. And she not only said how many they were created, but who made them. No one's ever known the artists before, who they were sent to, the dates that they were sent, and also the process leading up to that. And so one of the things that's spectacular about these petitions is that they were the first time that a petition had been put to Parliament in both Yolŋu Mata and English, or English and an Australian language, any Australian language, and that they had been presented in an Indigenous form of communication, which was the bark paintings that these paper petitions had been stuck onto. And so these were presented with the seemingly the 8 points that were requests of the Yolŋu people for what they wanted to have happen. And essentially they weren't protesting against mining per se, they were protesting against the breaking of Yolŋu law, which was that they had not been consulted, that they had not consented, and that they had not been compensated in any way. And they were asking for there to be a cessation of activities until such time as compensation and consultation about what was going to go on their lands occurred. But again, they still at this point had no idea that they weren't their lands, to be reckoned with and to be negotiated about. We can talk about that a bit more in terms of the petitions as not being petitions at all, which is what the discovery of the title Näku Dhäruk did for my whole thinking about this. So that's essentially the story of the petitions. So they are put to Parliament in August 1963, and then that kicks off the second half of the story in terms of the book. And maybe I won't add any spoiler alerts there.
No, we'll let people discover that for themselves. So many things to pull out from what you've been talking about. I think one of the things that's really interesting in your work as a historian is your focus on physical objects and how they kind of colour our understanding of history. And one of the things that's, as you say, this discovery about who the painters were for the bark paintings. Can you talk about what it means to engage with these physical objects and how they change the way we react to our histories?
Yeah, great question, Alice. And this is the third installment of my democracy trilogy, as you said in the introduction. And the trilogy really turns on the material heritage of Australian democracy. So the Eureka flag, the women's suffrage banner, and the Näku Dhäruk, the Yirrkala Bark Petitions. And one of the things that I think is that if we see these as our founding documents in Australian democracy, you know, America has its founding documents in democracy, its Constitution, its Declaration of Independence, its Bill of Rights, and these are treasured objects. You know, there's a whole centre built for them, and people make pilgrimages to see them, really revered. All of those are really documents that are top down. They're written by educated white men, and they are written they talk about we the people, but they are written for the people. What I think is really interesting about Australia's democracy is that these items, which I would argue are our we the people moments, each one of them represents a moment in our history: 1854 at the gold rushes, 1902 at Federation, 1963 with the presentation of the Yirrkala Bark Petitions, where the concept of who the people are is being expanded. We the people, but who are the people? Who are included in that body politic? And each of these documents was handmade by those people who were expressing that sentiment upwards towards other powers that be. Although, as I say, I've come to question that a little bit after I was given the title Näku Dhäruk. It is not an upwards movement, but this is a handmade democracy. These are material items that were, in the case of the Eureka flag, sewn by women overnight, as the Eureka flag is a symbol of the Southern Cross, the constellation, that everybody who was here on these goldfields was now united under. It was the one thing in this polyglot community of immigrants, the one thing when they looked up at the night sky, now in the Southern Hemisphere, because the majority of them had come from the North, that united them. And that becomes the symbol of both their resistance, but also their new identity as new Australians. At the turn of the century in Federation, women who had fought at Eureka for those rights, but not won them for themselves, for the franchise rights, for the right to be heard, the right to have a voice, they then proclaimed that in that Federation area, we will help you build a nation, but we must be counted in that nation. Our voices must be heard. We must have the vote. And the women's suffrage banner that was painted by Dora Meeson Coates, an Australian woman in England, helping out with the suffragette movement that came after Australia's global world leading rights in democracy, after women had run those rights in Australia, white women. That painting also tells that story of women demanding the right to be heard, as does this. It's exactly the same ambition and sentiment in that sense. It's claiming the right to be heard, to be counted. We are here on this land. This is our place. We belong here. And so I think these material items allow us to tell the story of these moments through them in a way that just going to the archives themselves. And I, as you well know, as you said, I podcast Archive Fever with my colleague Eve Rees. I'm a complete archive nerd. But what the archive is can be very expansive. As I said before, country was archive in this book. The land itself is archive. So I think that when we just rely on the paper colonial records, that, you know, what we might call the colonial archive, the paper records, just the things that people who were literate and who had access to the tools of literacy of the time, the things they create, the ways in which they represent themselves and their ideas and their ambitions. It's a limited archive, that one. Obviously important and has to be used, and I spent months and months and months of years of my life immersed in it. But it becomes a more complicated picture when you start to weave in the other ways in which people have historically expressed themselves. And I think that's what looking at material objects can do. I'm the new chair of the National Museum of Australia, and we have the great privilege of being the custodians of the National Historical Collection, which is hundreds of thousands of items, objects. And so I'm more acutely aware than ever of the value of objects to tell stories, or to be the vessels for stories, and to be so multifaceted, and to be able to express ideas in ways that paper can't always do.
That said, one of the extraordinary things that I alluded to before is the writing of this book, and the way that you use techniques that we might otherwise associate with fiction, including scene setting, beautiful language, descriptions, similes, metaphors, the way that the people in this book are such rich characters. Can you talk about your writing process and how you go from this incredibly sophisticated and intellectual exercise of synthesizing all sorts of information into this really emotional, beautifully written work?
Yeah. So my first book was the published version of my PhD thesis. It's called Beyond the Ladies' Lounge. It's the history of female publicans in Australia. And because it was a thesis first, it's argument driven. And I think that it's, partly led by the subject matter, pubs, sexy topic, and it's full of oral history interviews. So I was talking to really incredibly interesting, engaging women, and the charisma of that study, I think, comes out in some ways. But coming as it did from a thesis, it's an argument-driven book. When I came to writing the Eureka book, which came out of my postdoctoral research, so absolutely rigorous research process, as you say. I mean, I'm a fair dinkum academic. They don't give professorships away. But I didn't have to have that examined by anybody. And what I really knew I wanted to do was write a book for a general readership. So I thought about the books that I liked reading. And to tell you the truth, they weren't history books. I like reading novels. I like going to bed with that question in my mind: what's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? I know I should turn out the light and go to sleep, but I really need to know what's going to happen next. And I wanted to take that curiosity, the reader's curiosity, into the way that I wrote that Eureka book. I also wanted to write from the archives. And I felt like the gold rush was such a baroque period of time that the writing, because it's so deeply immersed in archive, and archive becomes so much of the source material, not just the source material, but the actual quotes. As you'll know in all of these books in the trilogy, I don't use quote marks. I tip the source material into italics, something I stole from Kate Grenville's The Secret River, and that's what she does with dialogue. So there's no quote marks around dialogue. And what I found then was that it created much more of this seamless sort of sense of narrative between that I was providing the kind of connective tissue between the source material, but we weren't standing aside from it, which I think is what quotation marks do. But even with Eureka, I finished a draft of it. I come to the end of my funding. I put it in a drawer, and that's when we went to Arnhem Land the first time at the end of that period. But during that period, I also made my first documentary for the ABC. It's called Utopia Girls, about how Australian white women became the first women in the world to win full political equality with men. And I was the presenter, so on screen, staring down the barrel of the camera, and I was and I wrote the script, and going through that exercise of writing essentially probably 200,000 words, I wrote in script drafts that ended up the shooting script, the actual narrative that I deliver in voiceover and in scenes in pieces to camera is about 5,000 words. So one, there's that extraordinary distillation. And where the distillation comes from is not about material that's just you think is intrinsically interesting, but it's about where do the story beats lie. And once I had written for television, I went back to that draft of Eureka and rewrote it very much with that, where are the story beats? And more particularly, who are the characters? And where is the character development? Because that's what we get in novels. And that's why we watch Netflix and all of the other scripted television that is so incredibly popular now, because we become invested in the characters. And to start to see historical protagonists as characters and to follow those same rules of character development, I think was really shifted my thinking about how to write history. And it's really difficult to do because as an historian, I think that if doctors have a pact that is do no harm, historians' pact with their audience is don't make shit up. So there's a lot of times where you can't get a character from A to B because you haven't got any archive that does that. But how do we follow them on their journey from A to B when we know they're going to pop up again at C? And so that for me became the challenge of keeping those characters in mind. And I feel like I've developed that over the 3 books. And this is the one that does it, I think, most successfully, is writing from within the action and on the heels of the characters. So if they don't know what's going to happen next, neither do we as the reader. And that gets rid of that sort of omniscient historian's voice that can write with the benefit of hindsight, because so much of history is written with the benefit of hindsight. And I think what that makes it look like is that history is inevitable, that the way that events roll out has some sense of inevitability to that. Whereas when you are writing from within character and on the heels of those characters, and you're following their lives along, one, you're more invested in them, and two, you're actually living life much is the way that you and I live life, and everybody lives life. We don't know what's going to happen this afternoon. We just know the choices that we've got to make now. And I was much more interested in that. What are the choices these people are making?
It's very successful. This is the last question from me, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience. So please pop your questions in the chat. You mentioned earlier on about this book having lots of collaboration in it.
Yeah.
And there is the sense, not just from your acknowledgements, but also from the recognition of the sources and the conversations that you tell. How did the collaborations play out, and how are they different when you get into the sort of the pointy end when you have to make a physical book?
Yes.
Versus the maybe more expansive collaborations that happened earlier on in the project.
Yeah. So the earlier collaborations were just a lot of talking, just a lot of sitting around at ceremonies or in houses or in people's front yards, just talking. Then I had a period of time. So, I was going back up and down to Arnhem Land over, 15 years now, almost, that I've been going there. I had the opportunity in 2021. I escaped, so I'm from Melbourne, and I escaped between lockdowns 4 and 5 and went to the Northern Territory. I spent a week in the Darwin Archives, and then I spent 2 months in Arnhem Land. And that was the time at which I was actually able to sit down I just used my phone as a recorder. I sat down and I recorded interviews with people where I had a much more of a sense of who I wanted to talk to, which was very much who I was being led to talk to, because one of the ways in which Yolŋu governance works and Yolŋu community works is there are cultural protocols about who can speak about what and who are the right people to talk for what. And so I needed to be led to the people who I needed to talk to in a formal way. And so once those were identified, and I was able to sit down and make the recordings, and then I was able to take notes from those. And then when it came, I wrote the first draft of the book in 2022. When it came to writing those out, when I used those people's words or information that they had given me, I made note of it in what became the Fat Manuscript. And then I went back up to Arnhem Land at the end of in 2022 and 2023. I had two separate trips where I then took that physical first draft and sat down with the people I'd originally spoken to and read out the passages of the book in which I'd used the things that they had told me. And I'd also had some group meetings had a Yirrkala Dhäruk, so a women's meeting, and a Näku Dhäruk, a men's meeting. And those were sort of 2 3-hour sessions for groups of people. And so I would go back and I'd read through the sections and make sure people felt that I was representing what they had told me properly. So that what their term for that would be, that it was Yolŋu, the true story. Yolŋu is sort of true, and Dhäruk was story or the news. So that once they were happy that it was the Yolŋu, then I sort of was able to tick that off and feel like I had received the consent that I needed. And some people had passed since those, including Gulleroy, since those original interviews. And so then I took the material to family members, to the correct next family member, to receive their assent to it. So there's lots of photos of me sitting in the red dirt with my manuscript, with children on my lap, and reading things and ticking things off. And so I felt like that was the best way that I could keep faith, that consent could be given, and that people knew that I wasn't just taking. Yolŋu people have an expression for white people, which is that they are plastic bags. They're called Ngāpuki is the name for outsiders or non-Yolŋu people. That Ngāpuki are like plastic bags because they're white, they blow into town, they flap around and make a lot of noise, and then they blow out again. I was very determined not to be a plastic bag. I was also adopted when we lived there in 2010, was adopted into the family and the kinship system. So I'm actually through that related to everybody. And then but the fact that I kept coming back and kept coming back and kept coming back was how those relationships of trust. And that's really what it's about. It's really about relationships and networks of trust.
I think, how about I save that and we'll go to questions. A question from Anne Gisborne, who says, have you thought about reframing this book and making a version for young people? I know that you've done that with your work in the past.
Yeah, I hope to do it for the whole democracy trilogy. So there is a YA version of the Forgotten Rebels of Eureka. It's called We Are the Rebels. And that's had a great uptake in school because, of course, the Eureka Stockade I studied in school. You're a lot younger than me, Alice. You probably studied in school. My kids studied it in school. It's a perennial on the history curriculum. So having this new way for teachers and students to be able to access that story in a much more inclusive and diverse way, because it's led by the research which was looking for what the women were doing, and then the story that came out of that has been terrific. And I still get that was published in 2016. And I get a lot of feedback from teachers that that has been such a useful teaching resource. I very much want to do the same thing for You Daughters of Freedom and for Näku Dhäruk, because similarly, the topics of suffrage, Utopia Girls documentary is actually on the Year 12 history curriculum.
Oh.
And so that's become a teaching resource. I also made a documentary for the ABC called The War That Changed Us, that for the centenary of World War One, and the Department of Veterans Affairs, who funded that with the ABC, put a copy of that 4-part series in every school in Australia. And I've also had a lot of teachers saying it's great to have these very robust scholarship, but methods of communicating that research that really land with people, and particularly that can land with kids. So great question, and I'm on it.
Excellent. If only we could clone you, and then that would happen a little bit more quickly, perhaps. There's a question here from John Coursier who says, the attitude of the first Europeans re land grabs is still the same today. For example, ignoring the rights of First Nations owners. Do you think the Bark Petitions, maybe he means, the book and bringing it to a different audience, will have an impact on these attitudes?
I'd like to say yes. It was one of the. I'm a glass half full kind of a gal. So you. That's why you write history. You write history hoping that it can inform the present day and future policy as well. I was very pleased to see that this book was named by the Grattan Institute as the #1 on their Prime Minister's summer reading list. That sense that you want people who are in positions of influence to be able to read and relate to things that have happened in the past, and then possibly make different decisions on the basis of it. So I'd really love to think that that might happen. One of the things that happened along the way during the period that I was researching was that Rio Tinto blew up the Jurkhan Gorge caves. Things like that make one feel like the whole thing is hopeless. That white people with pecuniary interests will always have the impulse to override the knowledge and respect of cultural knowledge holders, traditional owners. The world views are so distinctly different that they just can't find it in their hearts or their pockets to respect the differences. I'm not everything is hopeless. I'm not a nihilist. I do think that that literature and history can change attitudes. It can slowly shift the dial. And I think one of the reasons I have tried to situate this so much on country and in country and give people a sense of being there is to not only change minds, but to change hearts. We had the voice referendum last year that came out of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I had to sort of delay finishing the book, bringing it to conclusion until that happened. I was very involved in campaigning for the yes vote, but also just to see how that played out, how the results of the no vote played out. One of the heartbreaking things was that voice referendum occurred exactly 60 years from the Bark Petitions, which were a cry for the right to be heard. They were not a cry, they were a request. They were a dignified diplomatic request from one sovereign nation to another sovereign nation, from the Yolŋu nation to the Australian nation, to be heard on an equal basis. to negotiate and come to an agreement making. And 60 years later, that essential same impulse was rejected, and not by government, but by the people. And we all will have our views as to why that happened. But I think that time will come again. I think things are changing. And I think we can see that in the demographics of who voted in what direction in the voice referendum. So one can only do one's small part in that. But I know this is certainly a story that Yolŋu wanted to have told and want all Australians to read. I had the national launch of the book in the beginning of October in Yirrkala, and 6 or 7 Yolŋu people spoke at the launch, and the very strong message coming out of that is that this is our story and we want Australians to know it, and that is the healing. That healing has occurred through the process of writing the book, but the healing is really in Australians taking on, white Australia taking on the wisdom and the logic and the pain and the beauty of the Yolŋu world.
I think one of the things some people missed was the generosity of the referendum, how generous the offer was. And again, this is a generous, both, I think it's a generous book, but I think it's also a generous approach from the Yolŋu people. There is quite a long question here from Leo Grogan. I'm just going to see if I can, maybe I will just read the whole thing.
Okay.
My first encounter of Yirrkala before seeing the partitions at Parliament House was being transfixed by a Ken Duncan panographic photo of 5 young children sitting beside the sea on a rock. Maybe you've seen it in the gatefold of the Midnight Oil 1987 album Diesel and Dust. I've always been curious about Yirrkala and how it might have changed over the years between the 60s, 80s and present, and how the publication of your new book will surely give greater prominence to this place.
So Yirrkala, well, I know Yirrkala in 2 ways. I know it from the place that I have been to for the last 15 years, and I know it from 1963. Intimately, I know it in 1963 from the archive, and then I know it from an understanding, a very rudimentary understanding of country. And one of the things that I know about the place is that the more I know, the less I know. And that's, the more I listen, the more I realise there is to learn and to sit quietly and listen. It's just like you scratch the surface and then there's a crater emerges. So one of the things that was incredibly, in a sense, heartbreaking about researching the book that I couldn't prefigure because as I suggested, of the way that I write it, which is in the present moment, is knowing what happened to Yirrkala, knowing what happens over the succeeding decades, where it goes from being, essentially Yirrkala people were completely, this is a word that will have all sorts of poor resonances, but completely tribalized to the extent that their culture was utterly preserved, as it had been for tens of thousands of years, to one that very quickly adapted to the incoming white deluge that happened once. And here's the spoiler alert. Well, it's not really. I mean, you can go to Google Maps and go to Nhulunbuy and look at the township, so you know what happened, and look at the global maps, the satellite maps, at the great red scar that happened is in the land between the green of the Gadeka trees, which is the mining that occurred. But not just what the environmental impacts of mining were, but what the social impacts were. And what Yolŋu people will tell you is that it wasn't the Bible that really did the damage. It wasn't even the bulldozers that really did the damage. It was the bottle that was the curse, and that still lies over the land. So when the town of Nhulunbuy was built as the mining town to service the bauxite mine, the pub came. And so that was the first time in the 1960s that Yolŋu people were introduced to alcohol in that way, in terms of open access, essentially. And in fact, Yolŋu people went to court to prohibit the license being granted, because they'd seen what had happened in Darwin. And one of the points of the Bark Petition is actually, we do not want the fate of the Larrakia people to be ours. Having seen that colonial frontier. This is the frontier came very late to northeast Arnhem Land, but Yolŋu people were aware of the implications of that and tried to stop it, and were unable to stop it. So while Yirrkala is an extraordinarily, and Gundungurra, which is the Gumatj community, so Yirrkala are really the traditional owners, and in Yirrkala, where the mission was, is Yirrkala land, and that's that township. But there are also there's a community and homelands at Gundungurra. There are Yolŋu who live in Nhulunbuy, and then a series of other outstations, homelands at Gartalala and Baniyala and Branbran, Gangan, where Yolŋu people are also living as well, went back to in the 70s, trying to get away in many respects from the onslaught of what was going to happen. I don't want to paint a negative picture of it, but the social dislocation of what happened in the 60s and 70s, the effects of that are absolutely still ongoing. Do I hope it draws attention to the region? Absolutely. And one of the reasons why is because mining is about to pull out. So the mine that came and did and created this extraordinary environmental and social destruction is now leaving again. And effectively within 2 generations, 60 years, there's now going to be this huge drain of the white population, because the mine is really the only form of industry there. It'll remain a service town. But what happens next is really anybody's guess. And one of the things that Yolŋu people are very much trying to do is establish tourism enterprises of their own. Yolŋu-led, Yolŋu-run, cultural knowledge transfer, cultural tourism to the area. And that can encompass history and cosmology and art and healing practices and bush food and bush medicine and all of that. This is what is so wonderful about the area, and the fact that the mission history that I mentioned before, it is all completely preserved. Yolŋu people speak English as a 5th language. There'll be 4 Yolŋu languages they speak fluently before that. When there is a bungal, a bungal baparu ceremony for funerals, or what some people in the West like to call sorry business, everything, all Yolŋu were there, and everything stops for it, and it can go for weeks, and all the ceremony is still played out. All the young kids learn ceremony at the heels of their parents. And so there's wide education, but Yolŋu culture is still so strong, and it is a daily practice of it. It's not just Garma Festival once a year where the politicians and the corporates fly in to see the circus rolled out. It's a daily practice.
Well, I don't know if this is a question that you can answer relatively quickly.
Okay.
But
as you'll see, not my strong point, but I can try.
But just one last question. Now that you've completed this wonderful trilogy encompassing so much of our real Australian history, where to from here for you?
Well, a nap. Yes. That's a very short 1-word answer. I need to have a big, long nap.
Excellent.
A bit of rest will be good, but less facetiously, I've got a number of projects on the go, a couple of television projects, my work at the museum, my work at La Trobe as the Professor of Public Engagement. Research communication is really the thing that turns me on across a number of platforms. I've got 2 podcasts that I run. Some people have asked whether I will turn the trilogy into a quartet using the Uluru Statement from the Heart as the 4th material object. That is quite logical. The Uluru Statement from the Heart very much is very consciously in the tradition of the Bark Petitions. As I was saying earlier, in terms of our democracy being handmade, as is the Uluru Statement, there's an obvious, and it too is proclaiming the right to be heard. There's very obvious logical and material reasons to make it a quartet, but that's not, that story is not there to be told yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know whether I'm the right person to tell it. I think there's other generations coming through that will be more in a position to tell that story.
Mm. Well, I have already bought a couple of copies of this for Christmas presents. I think you should do too. It's an extraordinary book, and we're incredibly lucky to have both the book and to have Clare Wright for the last episode of Australia's Biggest Book Club for the year. Thank you so much, Clare, for being such a wonderful guest. There will be more details for next year's Biggest Book Club in your inboxes in the next little while, but we have one of Australia's biggest novelists coming on next year. If you're interested in the Australia Institute's research, you can find it on our website, australiainstitute.org.au. Don't forget to subscribe to the Australia Institute on YouTube, where you can find past episodes of Australia's Biggest Book Club. And you can buy a copy of the Australia Institute Press's first book, What's the Big Idea, on our website as well. Thank you so much, Clare, and thank you everyone for coming today.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified when we publish a new one. See you next time.